The subject for today is turn to your neighbor, preachers. In some churches now, the preacher thinks asking the congregation to turn to their neighbor in their seats and repeat what he says is effective, such as turn to your neighbor and say, "It won't be long." First time it's done, it's a good icebreaker. Then after the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth time it's done, it becomes ineffective to me. More like a game of Simon Says. And I'm going to offer some humorous examples of turn to your neighbor. I was in church the other day and the preacher asked the congregation to turn to their neighbor about 15 times. So after the 15th time, the congregation got up and said, "Preacher, repeat after us. Preacher, stop asking us to turn to our neighbor and say this and say that. Repeat after us. I'm going to preach the word so y'all can go home." And here's some more. Turn to your neighbor and give them a high five. Turn to your other neighbor and say, "It's getting hot in here." Turn to your neighbor and say, "We having fried chicken after service." Turn to your other neighbor and say, "You can only have 2 pieces." Turn to your neighbor and say, "You can't have fried chicken without cornbread." Turn to your other neighbor and say, "You gotta have sweet potato pie for dessert." Turn to your neighbor and say, "Church starts at 11 a.m. Turn to your other neighbor and say, "You're late at 11:15 a.m. Turn to your neighbor and say, "Don't try to leave before offering." Turn to your other neighbor and say, "We have offering plates at the exits." Now these are just some fictitious examples of turn to your neighbor, but sometimes, it is very humorous, some of the stuff the preachers ask you to say to your neighbor. And a lot of times, preachers do say turn to your neighbor like 10 or 15 times in the service. But that's just my opinion. Some of y'all may like that. That's all I have for you today. Thanks.